The radio crackled with static as Commander Joseph Rochefort bent over his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor, his eyes bloodshot from countless hours of deciphering Japanese naval codes. It was May 28, 1942, and the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance of intercepted transmissions. The Japanese characters before him spelled out a plan so audacious, so potentially devastating, that it could determine whether America would fight from the beaches of California or push back across the vast Pacific Ocean. "Admiral, they're coming to Midway," Rochefort announced to Admiral Chester Nimitz, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, despite the skepticism that had met his intelligence reports. The Japanese combined fleet, under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was preparing to launch the largest naval operation since Pearl Harbor. Their target, the tiny atoll of Midway, a strategic stepping stone that would give Japan control of the Central Pacific and potentially force America into a negotiated peace. Yamamoto's plan was masterful in its complexity. The architect of Pearl Harbor intended to use Midway as bait, drawing out the remaining American carrier fleet for a decisive battle that would crush American naval power once and for all. With 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu forming the heart of his first mobile striking force, under Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, Yamamoto commanded the most powerful naval armada the world had ever seen. Nearly 200 ships stretched across the Pacific, converging on the small coral atoll that most Americans had never heard of. But Rochefort's codebreakers had given Admiral Nimitz something invaluable: foreknowledge. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming, knew their strength, and most importantly, knew their plan. It was a David and Goliath scenario, with the American Pacific Fleet reduced to just 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle with gaping wounds in her flight deck. As dawn broke over Pearl Harbor on May 28th, the American carriers began their desperate dash toward Midway. Admiral Frank Fletcher commanded Task Force 17 aboard the wounded Yorktown, while Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance led Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet. These were not the seasoned veterans of peacetime exercises, but young men thrust into the crucible of war, many having never seen combat before Pearl Harbor thrust America into the conflict. The mathematical reality was stark. Japan's 4 carriers could launch approximately 270 aircraft, while the Americans could muster only about 233. The Japanese pilots were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, experienced warriors who had swept aside all opposition in their path of conquest across the Pacific. The American pilots, by contrast, were largely untested, flying aircraft that were often inferior to their Japanese counterparts. On Midway itself, the small garrison prepared for the inevitable assault. Marines and Navy personnel reinforced positions, knowing they were likely to bear the brunt of the initial Japanese attack. The island's strategic importance lay not just in its location, but in its airfield, a forward base that could extend American air power deep into the Pacific. If Midway fell, the path to Hawaii would be wide open, and with it, the potential for Japan to achieve the decisive victory that had eluded them since Pearl Harbor. The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned clear and calm over the Pacific Ocean, deceptively peaceful for what would become one of the most crucial days in naval warfare history. At 4:30 in the morning, Admiral Nagumo's carriers began launching their first strike against Midway, sending 108 bombers and fighters screaming toward the tiny atoll. The die was cast, and the battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War had begun. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron adjusted his goggles as he led Torpedo Squadron 8 off the deck of the Hornet, his 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers forming up in the pre-dawn darkness. These were obsolete aircraft, slow and vulnerable, but they carried the only weapons capable of sinking the massive Japanese carriers. Waldron had trained his men relentlessly, knowing that their chances of survival were slim, but their mission was critical. As they flew toward the Japanese fleet, he couldn't know that he was leading his squadron into aviation history, and that only one of his men would return. On Midway itself, the Japanese bombs began falling at 6:20 in the morning. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, rose to meet the incoming raiders. The outclassed American fighters were swept aside by the superior Japanese Zeros, but not before exacting a price. Major Floyd Parks led his men in desperate combat over the island, knowing they were buying time for the carrier forces racing toward the battle. The initial Japanese strike on Midway was fierce but inconclusive. The bombs damaged hangars and fuel storage tanks, killed personnel, and cratered runways, but the island's defenses remained largely intact. More critically for the Japanese, the American airfield continued to function, allowing the island-based aircraft to launch their own attacks against the incoming invasion fleet. This context, drawn from military historian Gordon Prange's comprehensive analysis of the battle, highlights how the Japanese failed to achieve their primary objective of neutralizing Midway's air power. Admiral Nagamo faced a crucial decision as reports came back from his strike leader. The island needed another attack to be completely neutralized, but American aircraft were already appearing on the horizon. At 7:15, the first American bombers from Midway began their attack runs on the Japanese carriers. The high-level bombing attacks were ineffective. The Japanese carriers maneuvered skillfully to avoid the falling bombs, but they served notice that American resistance was far from broken. The confusion aboard the Japanese carriers was mounting. Nagamo had kept half his aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacks on any American ships that might appear. But with Midway still functioning and his own ships under attack, he made the fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft with land attack bombs for a second strike on the island. This process required his planes to be brought below deck, rearmed, and refueled, a time-consuming operation that would leave his carriers vulnerable. At 7:45, Japanese received the radio message that changed everything. Enemy ship sighted. A Japanese reconnaissance plane had spotted the American task forces, but the initial report was incomplete, mentioning ships, but not specifying whether aircraft carriers were present. Nagamo hesitated, caught between the need to finish off Midway and the possibility of engaging the American fleet. This hesitation would prove catastrophic. The American torpedo squadrons were converging on the Japanese fleet from 3 directions. Waldron's Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, and Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown were all racing toward the same target, the Japanese carriers that represented the heart of enemy naval power in the Pacific. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic hours in naval history. 4 Japanese carriers steamed in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed and refueled. Approaching from the northeast, the American task forces prepared to launch everything they had in a desperate attempt to even the odds. The next few hours would determine whether the Pacific would become a Japanese lake or remain contested waters where American forces could begin their long road back to Tokyo. At 8:37 on the morning of June 4th, first American torpedo bombers found their targets. Commander John Waldron's voice crackled over the radio as Torpedo Squadron 8 approached the Japanese fleet. "We will go in. We won't turn back." His 15 Devastator torpedo bombers descended toward the water, flying straight into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire the world had ever seen. The Japanese carrier Akagi and her escorts erupted in a symphony of destruction. Every gun that could bear opened fire, creating a wall of steel and explosive shells through which the American bombers had to fly. Above them, 40 Japanese Zero fighters dove down like hawks, their cannons and machine guns chattering death. The slow, obsolete devastators were sitting ducks, but they pressed their attack with suicidal determination. One by one, Waldron's bombers fell into the Pacific. The squadron leader's aircraft was among the first to be hit, cartwheeling into the ocean in a splash of foam and flame. Lieutenant George Gay, flying the last aircraft in the formation, watched in horror as his fellow pilots died around him. His own plane, riddled with bullets and trailing smoke, managed to drop its torpedo before crashing into the sea near the Japanese carriers. Gay would spend the next 30 hours floating in the Pacific, hiding under a seat cushion and witnessing the entire battle from water level. The sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, the sacrifice of VT-8, was repeated twice more as the torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Torpedo Squadron 6 into the same hellish gauntlet, and his squadron suffered nearly as severely. Of the 14 aircraft that attacked, only 4 returned to Enterprise, and Lindsay himself was among the dead. The pattern repeated with Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron, brave men flying obsolete aircraft into almost certain death. But the torpedo attacks, though they failed to score a single hit, accomplished something far more significant than their crews could have imagined. They drew the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches to the carriers undefended. More critically, they forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, disrupting their formation and delaying their planned counterattack against the American fleet. At 10:24, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. The ship was the Arachi, hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after dropping depth charges on an American submarine. McCluskey made the decision to follow the wake, a choice that would alter the course of history. Following that white line across the blue Pacific, his 37 Dauntless dive bombers found themselves perfectly positioned above the Japanese carriers. The scene below was a bomber pilot's dream. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, steamed in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. Gasoline hoses snaked across the wooden decks, bombs and torpedoes lay stacked beside the planes, and the carrier's defensive fighters were still climbing back to altitude after defeating the torpedo attacks. McCluskey's voice was calm as he radioed his attack. "Earl, follow me down." Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led one section of dive bombers toward Kaga while McCluskey took his section toward Akagi. The Dauntless bombers rolled over into their 70-degree dives, screaming down through the thin air toward their targets. At speeds approaching 400 miles per hour, the first bomb hit Akagi near the elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding among the aircraft crowded below. The blast ignited aviation gasoline and set off a chain reaction of explosions that turned the proud flagship into a raging inferno. Within minutes, the carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor was a burning wreck, her captain and crew abandoning ship as secondary explosions tore through her hull. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, found the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits in as many minutes transformed the carrier into a floating volcano, her magazines exploding and sending debris hundreds of feet into the air. The Japanese carrier that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was reduced to a blazing hulk in less than 5 minutes of American dive bombing. The transformation of the Pacific War took place in the span of 6 minutes. At 10:24, the Japanese combined fleet commanded the ocean with 4 operational aircraft carriers and hundreds of veteran pilots. By 10:30, 3 of those carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted, ruins and their aircraft reduced to scattered debris floating on the Pacific swells. Admiral Nagamo stood on the bridge of the burning Akagi, his face a mask of disbelief as he watched his flagship consumed by flames. The carrier that had been his pride, the vessel from which he had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, was now a death trap. Reluctantly, he transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara, leaving behind the ship that had carried Japanese naval aviation to its greatest triumphs and now witnessed its greatest disaster. But the battle was far from over. The fourth Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been operating separately from the main formation and escaped the devastating American attack. Under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, one of Japan's most aggressive naval commanders, Hiryu immediately prepared a counterstrike. At 11:15, 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters launched from her deck, heading toward the American fleet with vengeance in their hearts. The attack found its target in the carrier Yorktown. Despite her damage from the Coral Sea battle, the American carrier had performed magnificently throughout the morning, launching the dive bombers that helped devastate the Japanese fleet. Now she faced her own ordeal as Japanese bombs screamed down toward her flight deck. 3 direct hits penetrated her defenses, starting fires and flooding compartments. But the veteran damage control parties fought back with desperate efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich led the damage control efforts aboard Yorktown, his teams working with practiced precision to contain the fires and counter-flood the listing ship. Within 2 hours, they had restored the carrier to operational status, a feat of seamanship that astonished even the Americans themselves. As historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command document, this rapid damage control response demonstrated the superior training and equipment of American naval personnel compared to their Japanese counterparts. But Hiryu wasn't finished. At 1:30 in the afternoon, a second strike of 10 torpedo bombers and 6 fighters found the partially repaired Yorktown. This time, the Japanese pilots pressed home their attacks with suicidal determination, knowing they were likely flying their last mission. 2 torpedoes struck the American carrier, flooding her engine rooms and leaving her dead in the water. Admiral Fletcher, his flagship crippled and unable to continue operations, transferred tactical command to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. The burden of completing the victory now fell to the man who had never commanded a carrier task force in combat before this battle. Spruance, a cruiser admiral thrust into carrier warfare, would prove to be one of the most capable naval commanders in American history. The final act of the carrier battle began at 5 in the afternoon. Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers toward the last Japanese carrier, with Lieutenant Earl Gallagher leading the formation toward Hiryu. The Japanese carrier, isolated and alone, fought back with everything she had. Her anti-aircraft guns created a deadly umbrella of fire, and her remaining fighters rose to meet the American attack. But the outcome was inevitable. 4 direct hits turned Hiryu into a blazing copy of her sister ships. Admiral Yamaguchi, the most capable of the Japanese carrier commanders, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the disgrace of defeat. As flames consumed the last operational Japanese carrier, he sent a final message to Admiral Yamamoto: "I am going to crash into an enemy carrier." The great Japanese carrier fleet that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was no more. In one day of battle, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, over 200 aircraft, and many of their most experienced pilots. The backbone of Japanese naval aviation lay beneath the Pacific waves, and with it died Japan's hope of achieving a decisive victory that would force America to negotiate peace. The sun set on June 4th, 1942, over a transformed Pacific Ocean, where the tide of war had shifted decisively in favor of the United States. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, 1942, the magnitude of the American victory became clear. The Japanese combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was in full retreat. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received the devastating reports with stoic silence. architect of Pearl Harbor, realized that his gamble for a decisive victory had failed catastrophically. The human cost of the battle was staggering on both sides. The Americans had lost the carrier Yorktown, 1 destroyer, and 147 aircraft. More importantly, 307 American servicemen had given their lives, including the heroic pilots of the torpedo squadrons who had sacrificed themselves to create the opportunity for victory. Their names would be remembered as long as naval aviation existed: Waldron, Lindsay, Massey, and dozens of others who flew into certain death to protect their country, but Japan's losses were beyond catastrophic. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, representing the heart of Japanese naval power, lay on the bottom of the Pacific. With them went over 250 aircraft and, most critically, many of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew. These were not just machines and men that could be replaced. They were the irreplaceable veterans who had perfected Japanese naval aviation through years of training and months of combat. Captain Richard Fleming of the Marine Corps provided a final punctuation mark to the American victory. Flying a Dauntless dive bomber from Midway, Fleming led an attack on the Japanese cruiser Mikuma, which had been damaged in a collision while retreating from the battle. Fleming's aircraft, already damaged by anti-aircraft fire, dove straight into the cruisers. After turret in a deliberate suicide attack, the explosion of his aircraft and its bomb load contributed to the eventual sinking of Mikuma, making Fleming one of the few American pilots to successfully execute a kamikaze-style attack during the war. The strategic implications of Midway were immediately apparent to both sides. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was effectively ended. The loss of 4 carriers and their air groups meant that Japan could no longer launch major offensive operations. The initiative had passed to the United States, which would use it to begin the long island-hopping campaign that would eventually lead to Tokyo Bay. Admiral Nimitz's assessment of the battle was characteristically understated but profound. In his report to Washington, he wrote that the victory was achieved through the courage of American pilots and the superior intelligence provided by the codebreakers. But he also recognized that luck had played a crucial role. The decision by Lieutenant Commander Miklisky to follow the wake of the destroyer Arashi, the timing of the dive bomber attacks just as the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, and the failure of Japanese reconnaissance to provide adequate warning of the American approach. The technological lessons of Midway would reshape naval warfare for the remainder of the conflict. The battle demonstrated the decisive importance of aircraft carriers and naval aviation, relegating battleships to supporting roles. It also highlighted the critical importance of damage control, as evidenced by the rapid repair of Yorktown compared to the inability of the Japanese carriers to control their fires and explosions. For the pilots and sailors who fought the battle, the victory was bittersweet. They had achieved one of the most decisive naval victories in history, but the cost in friends and comrades was heavy. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, would spend his life honoring the memory of his fallen squadron mates. His account of floating in the Pacific and watching the battle unfold became one of the most compelling personal narratives of the war. The Japanese, meanwhile, began the long and difficult process of rebuilding their carrier fleet. But they would never again possess the combination of experienced pilots, advanced aircraft, and overwhelming numerical superiority that had characterized their forces at Midway. As noted in Japanese naval historian Mitsuo Fuchida's post-war analysis, the battle marked the beginning of Japan's defensive phase in the Pacific War, from which they would never recover. The strategic initiative, the aftermath of Midway, reverberated across the Pacific and around the world, fundamentally altering the trajectory of World War II. As the damaged American fleet returned to Pearl Harbor and the remnants of the Japanese combined fleet limped back to Japan, both sides began to comprehend the true magnitude of what had occurred in those 4 days of June 1940-2. In Tokyo, the Japanese government and military leadership struggled to process the catastrophic defeat. The loss of 4 aircraft carriers and their experienced air groups represented more than a tactical setback. It was a strategic disaster that effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the Midway operation, took full responsibility for the defeat, though he would continue to command the combined fleet until his death in April 1940-3. The Japanese military's response to Midway revealed the fundamental weakness in their strategic thinking. Rather than acknowledging the decisive nature of their defeat and seeking a negotiated peace while they still possessed significant military assets, they chose to continue the war. This decision would prove catastrophic, as Japan lacked the industrial capacity to replace the losses suffered at Midway, while American war production was just beginning to reach its full potential. Emperor Hirohito, upon receiving news of the defeat, reportedly spent several hours in silent contemplation in his private chambers. The man who had approved the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent expansion across the Pacific now faced the reality that Japan's military fortunes had been reversed in a single day. The emperor's private thoughts were never recorded, but his public response was to authorize continued resistance, setting the stage for 3 more years of increasingly desperate warfare. In Washington, the victory at Midway was celebrated as the turning point that many had hoped for but few had expected so soon after Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt, meeting with his military advisors, recognized that the victory provided the foundation for a Pacific offensive that could potentially end the war within several years. The boost to American morale was immeasurable, coming as it did after months of defeats and retreats across the Pacific. The strategic planning that emerged from Midway would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. Admiral Ernest King, chief of naval operations, used the victory to argue for a Pacific-first strategy that would take the war directly to Japan. The island-hopping campaign that began with Guadalcanal in August 1942 was made possible by the naval superiority achieved at Midway. For the American pilots and sailors who fought the battle, the victory was tempered by the enormous cost in human lives. The torpedo squadrons that had been decimated in the morning attacks became symbols of American courage and sacrifice. Their story would be told and retold throughout the war as an example of what ordinary Americans could accomplish when faced with extraordinary circumstances. The technological innovations that emerged from Midway would revolutionize naval warfare. The importance of radar, demonstrated by the early detection of incoming Japanese aircraft, led to massive investments in radar technology. The superiority of dive bombing over torpedo attacks in the carrier battle environment influenced aircraft design and tactical doctrine for the remainder of the war. Intelligence gathering, which had been crucial to the American victory, received renewed emphasis and resources. The code-breaking operation that had provided advance warning of the Japanese attack was expanded and refined, contributing to numerous subsequent victories in the Pacific theater. The success of signals intelligence at Midway established its importance in modern warfare. The human stories that emerged from Midway would become part of American military legend. The courage of pilots like John Waldron, who led his squadron into certain death, and the seamanship of damage control teams like those aboard Yorktown, who kept fighting even as their ship was sinking, embodied the spirit that would carry America through the darkest days of the war. As the sun set on the Pacific in June 1942, the world had been changed forever by 4 days of naval combat near a tiny coral atoll that most people had never heard of before the battle. The Battle of Midway concluded not with a single dramatic moment, but with the gradual realization that the course of the Pacific War had been fundamentally altered. As the damaged Yorktown was finally abandoned on June 7, 1942, and slipped Pacific waves after being torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. She took with her the last remnants of the old order in naval warfare. The strategic impact of Midway became clear in the months that followed. Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific had been crippled, forcing them into a defensive posture from which they would never recover. The loss of experienced pilots proved particularly devastating, as Japan's training programs could not replace the combat veterans who had died in the burning carriers. American pilot training, meanwhile, was expanded and improved, creating a pipeline of aviators who would dominate Pacific skies for the remainder of the war. Admiral Chester Nimitz's official report on the battle, submitted to the Navy Department in June 1942, captured the significance of the victory with characteristic understatement. The enemy's plans and dispositions were well known to us several days before the battle. This simple sentence concealed one of the greatest intelligence coups in military history, as the American codebreakers had essentially allowed the U.S. Navy to fight the battle on their own terms. The technological lessons learned at Midway revolutionized naval aviation. The vulnerability of aircraft carriers to dive bombing attacks led to improved damage control procedures and better defensive armament. The importance of early warning radar systems was recognized, leading to the development of combat information centers that would become standard on all major warships. The coordination problems that had plagued American air attacks were addressed through improved communication systems and tactical doctrine. For the American public, Midway represented the moment when victory in the Pacific became believable. The 6 months following Pearl Harbor had been filled with defeats and retreats. The Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Singapore, and Burma had all fallen to Japanese forces. Midway proved that the Japanese military could be defeated, that their seemingly invincible naval aviation was not invulnerable after all. The human cost of the battle was commemorated in numerous ways in the years that followed. The Congressional Medal of Honor was awarded to several participants, including Captain Richard Fleming, who had died in his attack on the Japanese cruiser Mikuma. The names of the torpedo squadron pilots who had died in the morning attacks were inscribed on monuments and memorials across America, ensuring that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Japanese post-war analysis of the battle revealed the fundamental flaws in their strategic thinking. Admiral Yamamoto's plan had been too complex, dividing his forces and preventing mutual support when the crisis came. The failure to maintain adequate reconnaissance had left the Japanese carriers vulnerable to surprise attack. Most critically, the Japanese had underestimated American resolve and capability, assumptions that would prove fatal throughout the remainder of the war. The Battle of Midway established principles of naval warfare that would remain relevant well into the 21st century. The importance of intelligence, the decisiveness of air power, and the critical role of training and morale were all demonstrated in the 4 days of combat near the tiny atoll. Modern naval strategists still study the battle as an example of how superior intelligence and tactics can overcome numerical disadvantage. As the 75th anniversary of the battle approached in 2017, survivors of both sides gathered to commemorate the events that had changed their lives and the world. Japanese and American veterans, now elderly men, met on the flight deck of the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, their former enmity replaced by mutual respect for the courage and sacrifice displayed by both sides in that distant Pacific battle. Coral Atoll of Midway itself, now a national wildlife refuge, stands as a peaceful memorial to the men who fought and died there. The runways from which Marine fighters rose to meet the Japanese attack are still visible, though now they serve as nesting sites for the millions of seabirds that call the atoll home. In the waters around the island, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers remain as underwater monuments to one of the most decisive naval battles in history. The Battle of Midway had proven that in warfare, as in life, the outcome often depends not on the size of the force or the sophistication of the equipment, but on the courage, intelligence, and determination of the individuals involved. In 4 days of combat, a handful of American sailors and aviators had changed the course of world history, ensuring that the Pacific Ocean would remain a highway for freedom rather than becoming a Japanese lake. The legacy of Midway lives on in the United States Navy's commitment to excellence in training, intelligence, and technological innovation principles that were proven in the crucible of battle near a small coral atoll in the vast Pacific Ocean.